Hello, it's Zanele, and I'm dropping in to tell you what you can expect from this episode. It's a family affair, meaning it's just us, no guest, and I'm going to be sharing a story with you that is so special to me and so close to my heart, and that also happens to be turning 5 years old this month. I'm so happy and so proud of this work. To this day, it still defines me as a storyteller, as a writer. And I won't give too much away other than that because I'm about to read it to you. You're also going to hear interviews that I recorded while researching the story. Please note that back then I was not a podcaster. I was a writer. And so my recordings sound like recordings made by a writer and not like the interviews that I conduct for this podcast today. That means you'll hear plenty of interjections from me clicking my pen when I start to think really hard, talking out loud as I'm taking notes, and a bit more of a raw behind the scenes look at how I work as a journalist, and in particular, how I worked as a very new, very green investigative journalist who threw my heart and soul into piecing the story together because I knew that it was going to be special. Without further ado, let's get into the story.
And all I could remember was my dad coming home in tears. And the only name he could mention was Lucky.
On the middle of that fighting, suddenly you become aligned to the people that we are accusing.
That's why I'm saying that your house are built on top of the graves. Prove it to me. Who did it? Because halal. Remember, Tenfe was top people who were living there. There were government officials, there were members of parliament, there were a lot of big people who were living in Tenfe Estate, even now, this time. So basically, you wouldn't make no mistake.
My dad died a very premature death, and he fought for those graves. And that's all I have to say. The only name he ever said to me was Lad.
Dotted around the upmarket neighbourhoods of Fourways, crumbling graves hide in plain sight alongside busy roads and outside the boundary walls of townhouse complexes. They belong to the people who once lived and worked on hundreds of farms that made up northern Johannesburg before it became one of the city's fastest developing and most expensive areas. The graves are among a handful of burial sites that have remained in place since property investors began developing the area in the 1980s. Since then, developers have removed thousands of graves to local cemeteries. The graves are at the center of a long dispute between private property developers who own the Dainfin Golf Estate and the poor black farm workers who were moved from the land in the 1970s and 80s to make way for it. For the farm workers, the graves, some of which date back to the 1800s, are their only tangible link to the land that they were denied formal ownership of during apartheid. The interrelated network of families who own the graves have lived in the area since at least the 19th century. They are collectively known as Amandebele, and their presence in northern Johannesburg dates back to the splintering of Shaka Zulu's chiefdoms. So, for Mphoso Spielman Ngoma, Fourways will always be home. Welcome to Golden City. I'm your host, Zanele Mji, and I love a good story. This podcast is a collection of the greatest stories I've ever heard about the City of Gold, Johannesburg, South Africa. In each episode, you'll meet a different Joburger who will tell you their own true stories in their own words. All the ups and downs, adventures, lessons, wins and losses that make life in Joburg truly interesting. This concrete jungle may not have mountains or beaches to compete with the natural beauty of other South African cities, but the diverse and amazing people who call Johannesburg home make this golden city shine bright. What a story. How do you feel about that? Tell me more. Not the Fourways we know today, the flashy suburb characterized by endless construction and roadworks, malls, townhouses, where neighbors hide out behind high walls. The rural, quiet Fourways, where Ngoma once roamed the veld, played in the Yukske River, and walked barefoot to the historic Witkoppen School, known then as the Witkoppen Bantu School. Ngoma grew up on a plot of the sprawling 600-hectare Zevenfontein farm, where the gated estates of Dainfern Valley, and Steyn City now sit. He can still point out the exact place where his family compound stood, where he was born and later initiated into manhood, even now that it's been transformed into Dainfern's golf greens and mansions. But to access the property, he'd have to have his identity document captured at the gate and sign in as a guest of a resident. He's returned just a few times since Dainfern opened in 1992. Ngoma, who estimates that he was born around 1950, was the third generation of his family to live and work on Zevenfontein. He was named after his paternal grandfather, a wealthy man with more heads of cattle than Ngoma could count, and 2 wives. His grandfather became a labor tenant when land was seized from Amandebele and given to white soldiers returning from World War I. Hundreds of black families that were dispossessed in that way stayed in the area ngaphansi kwabelungu, or under the white people. As Ngoma put it, Ngoma is related to many of them in some way. The black people who were spread across Zevenfontein were a cultural mix of Abatswana, Abasotho, and Amandebele. The Ndebele settlement spread all the way north from Fourways into Lanseria and the cradle of humankind. They're a close-knit community. Many of them share a few common surnames. The Mahlangus, the Siemelas, the Ngomas, the Sitsoles.
Sihlobene ngoba abantu bathathene khona lapha sahlobana ngaleyo ndlela leyo abanye bathathana ke bayinto iwani balivile liwani.
Amandebele who, over generational cycles of dispossession, have been pushed out of the area. Now only their graves remain as symbols of their former way of life and monuments to a community whose history has been completely sanitized from the area. The graves are now nothing more than unremarkable heaps of caked earth, stone, and wildflowers. The few that remain after hundreds of others were either removed to local cemeteries or buried under the strip malls, petrol stations, and complexes that make up Fourways today. When they did still live on Zevenfontein, each family buried their loved ones in small informal graveyards on their property that became part of the homestead. Ngoma remembers that around 1957, when he was 7 years old, his father and baby brother both died within months of each other. They were buried in the small family graveyard where Ngoma's grandparents and other relatives who had died long before Ngoma was born also lay. The graveyard was a part of daily and spiritual life for the Ngomas, a place where they visited ukupahla, to talk to their forebears and seek wisdom and guidance from their ancestors. Ngoma thinks back on rural life fondly, but his memories are undercut by the bitterness of black life under apartheid. The passbooks that they carried everywhere they went that limited their movement, the control that the white farm owner exerted on their lives. Ngoma's father was limited to keeping a maximum of 4 head of cattle.
Kwakunzima leso sikhathi ukuphatha amadompasa. Uthenga leso sikhathi ukukherwa amadompasa kwaba nomuntu osondela kithi ngoba sasazi ukuthi leso sikhathi akunanto ongayikhuluma, akunanto ongayenza ngaphandle kokuthi nje ubone umlungu wakho ibekuye obaphambi kwakho.
Ngoma says that back then, they had no choice but to see the white man, especially the white farm owners who employed them, as ahead of them or above them. No memory is as bitter as the wave of evictions that began taking place in the 1970s, when property investors began taking an interest in Fourways as an extension of the nearby Sandton, already taking shape as an affluent residential and business district. Ngoma's family was evicted from Zeefontein in 1975.
Leso sikhathi sasihlala eSeefontein, sazalelwa khona eSeefontein, sakhulela khona sangena isikolo, kuze kwafika la mina ibe yimi ophatha umuzi wasekhaya ngoba sasiseplazini lomlungu. Kuthe ngaleso sikhathi ke kwatholakala ukuthi sekufanele ukuthi simove bathi indawo sebayithengisile singazi ukuthi kanjani sekufanele simove.
In a wave of evictions that began in the 70s and lasted right through the 1990s. Apartheid-era eviction trucks, known as GG because of their number plates, carried his people to unfamiliar and faraway places such as Soweto and Alexandra townships, and the Bantustan known as KwaNdebele in modern-day Mpumalanga. Ngoma says the evictions were so sudden that his uncles who took the cattle out to graze in the morning were not there to return them in the evening, and they roamed. The families lost all that they could not fit on the beds of the trucks. How were we supposed to take our graves? He asked me.
Kwakunzima leso sikhathi sadonsa nzima njalo kuze kwafika isikhathi sokuthi manje fanele sisuke ngamandla le company ayithenge lapho bathi iJonic yasusa kabuhlungu kileyo ndawo sasinenkomo sifuyile sasuswa kabuhlungu kwatholakala ukuthi nenkomo ebefanele ukuthi sizilayiche kwabanzima nezimvu nenkuku sashiya kileyo ndawo. Mina kwabanzima kimi ngoba ngangisebenza ukuthi ningibuye emsebenzini ngisikelwa indawo ekhaya ukuthi umama ngamboni umama akenye ikamera mina ngenye ikamera bathi akufanelanga ukuthi ngimbone.
You see, at first the Ngomas tried to resist their forced removal and they stayed put in their houses. But Bab Ngoma says that one day the contractors on site dug such a deep trench that he could not cross it to get from his house to his mother's house. They left soon after that.
Kwaze kwafika leso sikhathi ke sathola indawo ke ngase Webkopene sahlala la kunamathuna njengamanje sahlala kileyo ndawo. Kuthe sihlezi kileyo ndawo kwaba nenkinga yokuthi manje sifanele ukuthi siyokubona abantu bethu abalele ngase Zeefontein la suka khona. Saloku sibavakatshela njalo kwathi ekugcineni kwaze ukutholakala ukuthi asisafanelanga ungena kileyo ndawo sebakhile siphushwa kileyo ndawo kuthiwa asisafanelanga ukufika lapho.
They did continue to visit their graves on the construction site, however, until one day they found that Danefern's 2-meter-high boundary wall was complete and they could no longer access the grave sites. They never saw their graves again. When Terence Landwehr called me on a Saturday morning in September 2017, he warned me not to reopen the graves issue because I would find, quote unquote, a lot of aggression. Landwehr, whose German name means defender of the land, said that the Dainfern grave issue was, quote, sensitive and difficult for everyone involved, adding that Amabungane, the investigative journalism center that I was working for at the time, was doing such good work exposing real criminals. I was just beginning to investigate claims made by the Zevenfontein families that Dainfern had failed to meet the terms of a negotiated resolution over the removal of the graves. This was despite the golfing estate announcing in 2006 that an amicable resolution had been reached. Landwehr, just like members of the Ngoma and Sisole families that I had spoken to, pointed a finger at a man named Lucky Moshimane for corrupting the resolution proceedings. And who is Lucky Moshimane? Moshimane is an activist and funeral parlor owner who elected to represent the Zevenfontein families in negotiations with Dainfern for compensation for the loss of their graves, homes, and livestock when they were evicted to make way for the development. The Homeowners Association, which had just taken over the running of the estate from Jonik in 2000, found itself facing a public relations debacle in 2004 when Moshimane alerted local and national press to the fact that the Zevenfontein graves were still missing and demanded that the Dainfern Homeowners Association account for where they had been taken to. Supported by about 100 Zevenfontein families, Moshimane organized and led a march to the front gates of Dainfern, where they placed coffins on the ground and demanded that sangomas, or traditional healers, be allowed access to the property to connect with the ancestral spirits and locate their mortal remains. Moshimane claimed that he too had relatives buried on Zevenfontein, but other members of the tight-knit Zevenfontein community said that he in fact did not. They said that he had grown up on a neighboring farm and had attended the Witkoppen Bantu school with Ngoma's nephews and nieces. In Diepsloot, a township nearby Dainfern, Lucky Moshimane was known as a well-connected and outspoken ANC activist.
kwaya kwazokufika lo mfana bathula ke Mshimane wasitshela ukuthi amathuna wenu la nivakatshela khona asesusiwe lapho asusiwe asiwe ngaseMamelodi manje babungoma sicela ukuthi lento siyimele ngamanyawo ngoba sasimthemba sisazi ukuthi uLucky mhlawumbe ngoba mfana okhulela ngaphasi kwethu uzasenzela into eright wasitshela ukuthi fanele sisuke siye eDenfen siyokhulumisana nabo sizwe ukuthi amathuna bawase kuphi.
Spielman Ngoma believed that Lucky Moshimane's activism and his work in the funeral industry is what fueled his passion and interest in the case of the Zevenfontein graves. Neither Jonik nor the Dainfern Homeowners Association could account for the missing graves. And that's, allegedly, when Lucky Moshimane used his burial industry knowledge to trace what could have happened to the graves. He allegedly produced a tender document from funeral services company Avbob that detailed that they had been contracted by Jonik to remove 590 graves from Zevenfontein in 1987. Those burial records reportedly showed that Avbob removed 363 Black people's graves and put them in 8 waterlogged mass graves 75 kilometers away in the township of Mamelodi, north of Pretoria. Avbob also removed 8 white people's graves and reinterred them in individual burial sites in the nearby Midrand Cemetery. In 2004, a representative of Jonik, Busi Pilane, made a statement to local paper The Fourways Review, defending Jonik's actions as in line with the laws of the time, the apartheid laws of the time. Privately, according to documents that I saw, They told Terence Landwehr that they were willing to defend their actions in court. That left the Dainfern Homeowners Association to diffuse an awkward, inherited mess playing out right on their doorstep. Already, rumors were beginning to swirl amongst residents that they were living on top of more than 200 graves that remained unaccounted for. Terence Landwehr told me that, quote, the Homeowners Association had no legal obligation to deal with the issues of the grave, and they considered obtaining a court order, but I decided to handle the issue personally. After extended negotiations with Moshimane, who was elected to represent the Zevenfontein families, Dainfern announced the resolution of the grave issue via a press release in 2006. And these were the terms. The Zevenfontein families had elected for Moshimane's funeral company, Tsuhu Funeral Services, to conduct a reburial of the 8 mass graves from Mamelodi Cemetery to Fourways Memorial Park, a graveyard about 3 kilometers from Dainfern. He also got the contract to erect a wall of remembrance at the new burial site. And finally, when the reburial was complete, Dainfern would allow the families to conclude the process in accordance with their culture. After 20 years, they would be allowed inside the estate to touch the ground, reconnect with the ancestral spirits, and carry them to their final resting place. This was a cultural rite called Ukulanda, meaning a collection. Dainfern told the families that they would place 1.5 million rand in trust to cover the costs of reburial, and that payouts to Tsuho Funeral Services would be handled by the state's attorneys. It was a very lucrative contract for Moshimane. He charged high fees for services, including 400,000 rand, over $21,000, for the administration of collecting affidavits and death certificates from the families. Tsuhu Funeral Services was paid 28,000 rand for a handful of sangomas, or traditional healers, who performed divinations at the gravesite on the day of the exhumation. It's a detail that stands out to anyone who's familiar with the way izangoma work. For such services, they would have usually accepted an offering of a couple of 100 rands. Remember also that this was back in 2004, when everything just cost much less. All in all, Tsuhu Funeral Services was paid 1.2 million out of the 1.5 million rand that Dainfern pledged towards the process. The other 300,000 went towards what Moshimane called a cultural fee or wake fee, 3,000 rand per family that they would be paid to cover the costs of a traditional wake at home after the reburial. I asked Terence Landwehr about the decision to pay the wake fee into Tsuhu Funeral Services account, and he told me that, quote, we had the mandate from the families to accept Lucky as their representative, and at all times they insisted we deal with him only. In my investigation, I found that that is when some major breakdowns began in the process. Spielman Goma says that on the day that the families gathered at the Witkoppen school to collect their 3,000 rand cash payments, Moshimane was not present. Goma was paid 3,000 rand for his father, baby brother, and grandparents' graves. He said he watched as some families were given 3,000 rand, some families were given half of that, and other families were paid nothing at all. According to a handwritten ledger that Bamgoma showed me, 100,000 rand was paid out that day. A Tsuhu employee explained to the families at the school that Dainfern had paid less than the original amount that they pledged, and so not all families would be paid. Then, Lucky stopped answering the community's calls. A few months after the reburial, the Ngoma family visited the new burial site and inspected the memorial wall, which they described as a mess. The names listed on the wall were a combination of people missing from Zevenfontein, living people, and people buried elsewhere. To this day, the wall remains incomplete, with bare-faced brick showing through where a plaque is missing. Bamgoma says that when he tried to contact Dane Fern and follow up on what happened, they would not speak to him. During our interview in September of 2017, Terence Landweer said that he was not aware that Lucky Moshimane had not honored his financial commitments to the Zevenfontein family, and that the Homeowners Association was also not aware that the memorial wall had not been completed. He said all of those details had been, quote, managed by Lucky. But a few weeks after the exhumation, Dane Fern was made aware of yet another loose end left by Lucky. The owner of the Fourways graveyard contacted them to tell them that he was still owed 160,000 rand for the new burial plot. He had been unable to contact Lucky by phone. This money had already been paid out by Dane Fern into the trust account. Terence Landweer said that he consulted with the other members of the Homeowners Association, and they decided to, quote, pass the hat around again and settle that amount.
So on that charge, you say you gave everyone what they were owed in terms of wake fees. You deny that you kept some of the money that was owed to people for wake fees.
No, ma'am. I not as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Not as far as I'm concerned, ma'am.
Yeah.
You're talking 15 years ago, but not as far as I'm concerned. Then did they appoint Mahlangu, that they Machaka, or they appoint me? They appointed me, my company, to do the job.
Yeah.
So if, ma'am, I made a profit out of it, is there anything wrong?
When I initially made contact with Lucky Moshimane in 2018, he completely denied defrauding Dane Fern and the Zevenfontein families. In fact, he went as far as to claim that the whole process had gone well and that all parties were happy with the outcome. It was only when I confronted him with the Homeowners Association's account and with the Zevenfontein family's account that he then changed his story.
This is the thing. This is the allegation, is that there was not transparency. The families say the money came out, they didn't get everything, and then from then, and when you say, you know, that this is a sentimental issue and it was never about money, the fact is that David paid your company a lot of money to move the graves, to do the consultations, to do everything. You know, I've seen the records. They did pay Tsoko a lot of money.
Correct.
So people, that's the allegation. People feel like, oh, Lucky got a business opportunity from this, but we were left.
But ma'am, I'm a businessman.
High and dry.
Ma'am, I'm a businessman.
But it wasn't a business situation.
Ma'am, this is the situation. The company then appointed me. Appointed me. I tendered for the job. I got the job. Was there a reason that I must share the money with them when I give what belongs to them?
Oh, well, they say they didn't get what belongs to them.
No, ma'am. What belongs to them, it was the wake fees they got. I've got evidence of that. So ma'am says to me, oh, Zanele Mji, they say you got a lot of money. Ma'am, those were my transport I was using, my facilities I was using, my company I was using, my effort, my time. Who else was supposed to be paid? So ma'am, in life, you happen to grow because people, they started now to have issues when you progress in life.
He said he had been unable to pay the Zevenfontein families and honor his other contractual obligations because Dane Fern had simply stopped paying him the money. He blamed the Zevenfontein families for the breakdown of the process, claiming that they had become greedy and tried to take more money than they were owed.
Remember, you cannot sell a grave. It was not a business. Graves are priceless. We are not going to make a monetary scheme here. We are not going to make money with our ancestors. I'll put my foot on the ground. Once we can do this, it means and that's what I don't want to belong in.
Remember also that Lucky owned a funeral parlor. Graves were exactly how he made his money. Everybody, Lucky, Bamgoma, and Terence Landweer, kept referring to a copy of a signed final agreement that recorded all transactions in connections with the graves and was kept in trust by Dane Fern. So I emailed David Wise, who was chief executive of Dainfern back in 2018, but had not yet joined at the time of the grave dispute. Initially, David invited me to come and see the final agreement, and then he changed his mind and elected to answer questions via email. He said that according to the records, the Homeowners Association had paid just over R1 million into trust before they stopped making payments because they, quote, discovered Mushmane to be a con during the process. On that point, he would not elaborate and instead referred me to the people who had negotiated the settlement. Enter Sam Sithole, Bob Spielman Ngoma's nephew, who also sat in negotiations with Dainfern.
Did you know any of these people?
Look at how they are structured.
Sam and I were inspecting the memorial wall at the new gravesite at Fourways Memorial Park.
I don't know. Because some of the graves was there, some of the people when they died were still young. But the names, the elders, they could tell you. There was no about They will definitely tell you because we were living around the same area. They will tell you there's no this person like this, there was no this person like this. But I think the idea was just to multiply the numbers and so forth.
How do you feel about how this, like how your family's memory is treated?
It's very bad. It's very bad because it's, it was so difficult. Not for me, because at least I could do something. I could still progress in my life. My kids could still benefit from my hard work. But for those people that they've hoped that they will finally get something out of it. Just so difficult. And what was more difficult, it was that when I first bought my brand new car in 2005, people think that maybe we got the money. And that was the thinking behind it. And today, when you live in this particular area or this estate, they'll question you, how did you get there? And they'll never think maybe he's working hard, he's doing this and so forth. That was the reason and thinking behind it, that I might have got a share out of it. I remember the Ngomas, when they're building the houses, it was also that thing. There might have been some money that, because they were on the committee, that they might have got something out of it. So it was a difficult thing.
Oh, there were people who suspected you guys that maybe
Yes.
you benefited and they didn't.
Yes. Not much. People will just talk behind closed doors or in the corners and so forth, but most of them, they're just talking to you.
Is your grandmother still here?
passed on.
No, she passed on. And your mother?
Pastor.
Passed on. Were they alive during all of this going on?
Yes.
Sam said that until I informed him, he hadn't been aware of Dainfern's decision to cut off Lucky, nor did he know what they had discovered about Lucky during the process. But while working alongside Lucky on the committee, he had developed his own suspicions.
When did you feel like you started to stop trusting Lucky?
Before we went to Fourways, to Mamelodi, before we started going to Mamelodi Cemetery, that's right. Actually, before then, but it was very difficult to convince. So I was being labeled like maybe I'm against Lucky, so something similar to that. And then later on, so I even stopped to go to the meetings and so forth until I was called back to challenge Lucky. But it was so difficult. So difficult.
So you were one of like the first people who started to...
No, I started questioning. I said, no, something is not right.
What did you suspect?
You know, like when I say, if the plan say we move from A to Z, let's stick from the plan moving from A to Z. You understand? Suddenly from A we move to G. Say, what about? We don't even get to Z. That was a problem that I was questioning about. First thing, if you say we've got 100 families that they deserve a real million money, and if you requested 3,000 rand per family, that means it's 300,000 rand. So if you go to the community and give them 1.5, you say they are supporting actor, but to Dainfen you didn't say that. Then it becomes questionable. That's how I started saying, no, something is not right. That's why I say Dainfen, they just wanted to conclude this thing and say, we're done.
They didn't care
No, they didn't care. They just wanted
about how the
yes,
families
yes,
were actually
yes.
compensated.
Because I think also in terms of the values of their houses, remember when you sell a house in Dainfen, knowing that there's this land thing, grave thing, that house might be built in on the grave side and so forth. Obviously, the buyer will question that and say, hey, there's still this unresolved thing. Why do I need to buy before? They like the Ngomas, they will never achieve anything. They're too old to start again. That's what else they can do. Nothing.
Spielman Ngoma has lived his entire life within a 10-kilometer radius of Zevenfontein, and he has witnessed the area change dramatically over 3 decades. When I was writing the story, I remember reading a blog post by property sales group, Private Property, that proclaimed Fourways the new North. I think the old North was nearby Sandton. Fourways was undergoing its second property boom since the 1990s and was attracting billions of rands of private and commercial development. In the middle of it all lies the iconic Dainfen Golf Estate, the blog announces, calling Dainfen hot property because of the lifestyle that residents enjoy, including bird watching, whiskey tasting, and a bridge club, plus a high-tech security system with biometric access and surveillance. According to Private Property, property prices are rising every week, and 2 properties had recently been listed at a historical high of 28 million and 30 million rand each. Now, it's not apartheid's oppressive laws, or even the double-layered electrified boundary wall keeping Spielman Ngoma out. He has been priced way out of that market. In 1995, a year after democracy in South Africa, the Ngomas were among the first beneficiaries to receive stands to build homes in Diepsloot, a township built by the ANC government to accommodate Fourways' growing squatter population, largely caused by the evictions for private development. So, while Dainfern's 1,200 households enjoy about 320 hectares of golf estate, private hiking trails, and other exclusive facilities, just 6 kilometers away, the majority of residents in Diepsloot share communal taps and toilets and live in shacks or government housing. It's a simple and stark illustration of the legacy of dispossession that started with the generation of Ngoma's grandfather and will not be righted during Ngoma's lifetime.
It was one. When we say Zevenfontein, we don't differentiate between Dainfen and Stein City. It was one place. And it's actually Zevenfontein with an S, not a Z. They just changed the name. That place is Zevenfontein.
No S.
Yeah. No S.
Oh, like 7 Fontaine.
No, S-E.
It was a sweltering December 2017 day in Diepsloot when I sought shade in front of Bab Ngoma's home with him, his younger brother Daniel, and his cousins Simon and Barney Sithole. All 4 men were in their 60s and 70s, and the grave of Simon Sithole's grandfather is still intact in nearby Cosmo City, dating back to 1888.
So ihlangana kanjalo ngoba bekwindawo eyi-1 bekuyi-7 Dainfen and Stein City no was sebefanteni indawo yonke.
Yile ndaba yamathuni.
The Sitoles lost graves when they were moved to Alexandra Township from a portion of Zevenfontein called River Glen, where Africa's most expensive luxury development, Stain City, now sits. Lucky disappeared before handing over government records of the reburial to Fourways Memorial Park. So the cemetery was unable to issue proof of grave ownership to the families. That means they now have no claim to the new burial site or to the remains there.
Old enough, siyayazi le ndawo le. Yithi besilusa, yithi besibona namangcwaba
We are old enough. We know that area. We herded cattle on that land as young boys. We don't know if all those graves were moved or if some are still there.
Because
We would stumble across graves when we were herding and the elders would warn us not to touch them. They didn't consult on where to find the graves, which means they're likely still there.
As we sat together, the men told me that there was not a door they had not knocked on, looking for help to get reburial records for the Mamelodi graves and trying to find ways to get Danefern and Lucky to account for why the reburial process was left incomplete. They said they'd been to the public prosecutor, the Hawks, and even the police to open a criminal case, but that the case had simply disappeared. They suspected because of corruption. The families waited in anguish for 30 years to find their graves, interrupted by the brief hope that Lucky gave them, only to find themselves back where they were before. Now when the family gathers, they always ask about the latest with Danefern and Lucky. The men told me they don't have the heart to visit the memorial wall at the new gravesite. The wall is a physical reminder of an incomplete process. Without having conducted Ugulanda, they know they will not be able to connect with their ancestors. Lucky's conduct casts doubts over every aspect of the reburial. And without proper records, the families question whether the remains reburied in Fourways are, in fact, from Zevenfontein. With the collective social, economic, and intellectual capital that Danefern's representatives brought to the negotiations, they find Danefern's version of how things went down unsatisfactory.
Yeah, kwangafika lapho. So
ukuthi iDenfern ukuthi ulike naye bekhona la. Zanga aletha ireport to reconcile. Kwaze ukuthi imali besidonate.
Lucky never brought a report to reconcile all the funds that Danefern donated. To show what happened. After they paid all that money, why didn't they call him to account for it? So we suspect that Lucky squandered funds.
And then for his memorial. You understand? So we suspect that mali ezaphuma like as squander. You understand? As long as is abantu.
Looking back, I missed an opportunity to ask Terence Landweer who the real criminals were. That was what I had set out to do as an investigative journalist. Find the bad guys, hold them to account. Lucky Mushimane is an obvious target. He allegedly took advantage of a desperate and disenfranchised community, profited from their story, and is accused of stealing from them. Danefern was just the beginning of his operations in the area. Tsuhu Funeral Services removed graves from nearby Stain City next door, some of which also belonged to the Ngomas, and had business operations removing graves from private developments throughout the northern suburbs. At the same time, Lucky's other company, Jumbo Security, was contracted by the city of Joburg to remove squatter camps and long-term occupants from farmhouses in the northern suburbs on land that had been earmarked for private development.
But I didn't take an advantage to grow myself into that as an advantage. No. I did deals with Stain City. I did deals with not Danefern. I never did deals with Danefern. I did deals with Lanzeria, Raypax, Robbie Ray. I did deals with him in the building construction and security. I was doing security in Stain City since the beginning. And City of Joburg.
I spoke to people in informal settlements, attorneys who'd worked on eviction cases, and people who had been evicted by Lucky. They remembered him as a sellout who worked with private developers to remove them from their homes. When I interviewed Lucky in 2018, it seemed as though his sins may just catch up with him. He was facing tax evasion charges for jumbo security. Perhaps Lucky Mushimane's most honest statement to me during a conversation that felt like it was peppered liberally with untruths was, quote, "I became successful not because I went to business school or had any training. I met these white men and I dared to speak with them and I dared to learn to think like them." But what drew me to this story and what kept me going through all the years and ups and downs of investigating and writing it was not a commitment to exposing Lucky's individual wrongdoing. It was about the bigger system at play for me. The real crime was not contained in a single moment or act. It played out systematically over generations, through actions sanctioned as illegal by colonialism and apartheid. The real crime was that under apartheid, companies like Jonik were allowed to take what they wanted from Black people. And after apartheid, people like Mushimane were able to just take advantage of them. The system also allows those with power, like white South Africans, to decide how much they want to be involved in the collective project of redress. They hide their privileges behind high walls and shield themselves from the ongoing realities that keep apartheid alive, such as inequality and crime. When Terence Lanvier told me that Amapungane was doing much more important work exposing, quote, real criminals, I was struck by how invested upper class and white South Africans are in the idea of wrongdoing as corruption or the standard sense of stealing public funds. But if journalists and all of us gloss over the opportunities to tell complex stories such as this one, then we do not tackle the subtle and not so subtle behaviors and attitudes that keep South Africa trapped in the legacy of apartheid. Wrongdoing is the continued benefit you reap while hiding yourself behind high boundary walls that shield you from your complicity. Racism is wrongdoing. At the time of publication, the Ngomas and Sitsoles were still determined to seek compensation for the loss of their land, livestock, and graves. They were waiting for the reopening of the stalled land claims process, although they were honestly not confident of a positive outcome. Those graves were our title deeds, they told me. On part 2, the next episode, the day I hailed a cab as a fashion writer and reached my destination, an investigative journalist. We also learn more about the life and mind of Lucky Mushimane.
I remember the day when I met Tata for the first time. He was very close to Dostin Matia. I don't know, but guys, give this guy his graves.
The Zevenfontein families finally get to confront Lucky.
Lucky, it's great that we have you on the line, and thank you for listening to the segment and for calling in.
And I share some important updates about Bob Spielman and his family. Thank you for visiting Golden City. If you liked this episode, like, follow, subscribe on all social media and streaming platforms. If you love this podcast, give us 5 stars. I'd love to feature you on Golden City. To submit your story, go to www.goldencitypodcast.co.za. See you next time.